I knew the numbers did not lie, but the people pushing them sure as hell did. It started on a Tuesday morning with one of those mandatory pep rally meetings where they serve stale donuts and corporate delusion. The new vice president of finance, Spencer, fresh off his master of business administration and probably still smelling like cheap body spray, was waving around a slide deck like he had personally cured cancer. Revenue up 24%, margins stable, no risk factors, all sunshine and corporate optimism. I sat in the back with my notebook and 15 years of institutional memory, raising one eyebrow because I knew those numbers were wrong. They were not simple mistakes. They were not a case of forgetting to carry the one. They were strategically massaged like a high-end client during convention week. Line items had been shifted, forecasts inflated, and risk disclosures conveniently trimmed to make the company look like a hyper-growth tech startup instead of the mid-sized logistics firm we actually were. I flagged 2 items in my margin. One projection showed a vendor contract that had expired 8 weeks ago. Another listed deferred maintenance expenses for our entire shipping fleet that had magically vanished from the ledger. I raised my hand calmly, even offered a polite smile. I asked if legal had reviewed these figures before they went to the board. Spencer gave me that patronizing smirk. Half frat boy, half self-proclaimed business guru. He thanked me for my concern and said they were all good. They were not. I knew it the same way you know when milk has turned before the expiration date. The stench of overpromised quarterly growth and underreported liability was all over that slide deck. But I did not push, not yet. I had learned my lesson years ago. You do not interrupt the show until the spotlight hits you. So I filed my notes, went back to my desk, and quietly started saving backup copies of every financial model and email thread I could find. Now, before we go any further, let us talk about you. Yes, you, the one listening while driving, folding laundry, or hiding from your family in the garage. 94% of you do not subscribe to this channel. That number is uglier than Spencer's creative accounting. If you want to hear how I made this entire corporate boardroom squirm in part 5 of this story, hit that follow button. It costs you absolutely nothing. But for our team, it means we can keep exposing corporate nonsense with a smirk and a middle finger. Anyway, I had spent 15 years in compliance at this firm. I was the kind of man who never missed a regulatory deadline, never gossiped, and never complained. Human resources called me low maintenance. Leadership called me reliable. Both of those terms were just corporate translation for saying they would never promote me, but God help them if I ever decided to walk out the door. I knew my value. I was the duct tape holding this rusted machine together. I kept the safety violations from stacking up, the regulatory inquiries from arriving, and the idiot executives from emailing each other things that could be subpoenaed in court. I remember a specific instance 5 years ago when the previous management tried to bypass local environmental regulations for our main distribution warehouse to save a few $1,000s. I blocked it immediately, showing them that the potential fines would exceed their savings 10 times over. They listened to me then, but this new crowd was different. Because I did not wear flashy suits or speak in empty corporate buzzwords, I was invisible. I was just the 55-year-old guy in the corner office who made sure we did not get shut down by the government. Until suddenly, they decided they did not need me anymore. Spencer's arrival marked a major shift. Suddenly, the chief financial officer, Lawrence, stopped answering my emails. Reports I used to review before board submissions started bypassing my desk entirely. The air got thin. Human resources started using phrases like streamlining workflows and realigning compliance under finance. I saw the writing on the wall. It was written by people who did not understand the regulations they were trying to bypass. But still, I did not panic. I archived every policy revision, every quarterly adjustment, and every sign-off chains. That included one little gem I had slipped in back in 2018. During a compliance overhaul no one cared enough to read. Back then, the company was recovering from a minor regulatory scare. The chief financial officer at the time was too busy golfing with auditors and dealing with a messy divorce to review anything longer than a text message. I restructured our entire corporate risk policy. Tucked into the back pages of a 60-page document was a clause I labeled Clause 12B. It was built around the statutory protections of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, specifically Section 18, USC, Section 1514. It explicitly stated that if any employee in a compliance role is terminated or restructured out of their position following a material misstatement of financial projections, the company is liable for triple damages, retroactive back pay, and full legal fees. At the time, it was just insurance, a silent safety net. Now, 6 years later, it was about to become a noose for them. For now, I sat in my cubicle, sipped lukewarm coffee from my faded mug, and listened to the whispers travel down the hallway like smoke before a fire. Something was coming. And I was not just ready. I was prepared. They called it a second quarter alignment meeting, which was corporate speak for bringing your own executioner. I knew what was coming before I even sat down. The energy in the conference room had that weird, sterile buzz, like a dentist's office where someone had just finished screaming. Our chief financial officer, Lawrence, who was in his mid-50s with a hair transplant that looked like it had been harvested from cheap carpet, opened the meeting with a heavily rehearsed grin. He started talking about margin preservation, operational fluidity, and strategic efficiency. In simple terms, it meant bodies were about to hit the floor. Spencer, the newly hired vice president of finance, was standing right behind him with his arms crossed, looking like a smug bodyguard at a corporate funeral. I counted 3 slides of introductory nonsense before the actual ambush began. Lawrence cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive watch. In the spirit of long-term financial sustainability, he droned, "We have made some incredibly difficult decisions. As of today, we will be restructuring certain non-revenue generating departments to streamline our operational overhead." I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I just set my pen down on my notepad and waited. That was when Lawrence's eyes flicked to me, filled with the fake sympathy of a man about to ask for your security badge. "Donald," he said, trying to soften his tone by tilting his head, "your compliance position is being absorbed under the finance department, effective immediately. We deeply appreciate your many years of service." "Absorbed," I repeated slowly, taste-testing the word as if it were laced with arsenic. "Yes," Lawrence replied. "You will be provided with an offboarding packet and assistance during this brief transition." I blinked once, maintaining absolute composure. "Is there a severance package?" I asked. That simple question stopped the room completely cold. The company's in-house lawyer, Bradley, who always looked like he got dressed in the dark and lived on a diet of pure smugness, actually laughed out loud. It was not a polite chuckle, it was a loud, chesty laugh, as if I had just told him a hilarious joke. "Oh, Donald," he said, shaking his head patronizingly. "No compliance officer negotiates severance here." There it was, the sentence that would echo in my mind for weeks, the final insult. I said nothing to Bradley, nothing to Lawrence, and nothing to Spencer, who suddenly found his expensive Italian shoes very interesting and could not make eye contact. I just looked down at my open notebook, closed it slowly, and stood up. The human resources representative, Megan, showed up exactly 5 minutes later holding a manila envelope. My security badge had already been deactivated. Megan, a young woman with a plastic, insincere smile, mumbled a rehearsed speech about next steps while offering me a cardboard box. She asked if I needed help carrying my things. I did not answer. I packed my desk slowly and intentionally. I took down my certificates, unpinned a faded yellow sticky note that said, "Check Clause 12B," and slid it into my wallet like a loaded bullet. I walked out under the flickering fluorescent lights of the building, past the display case of dusty corporate awards, and past the break room where someone had already taken my mug. The world kept spinning outside as if I had never existed in that building. But beneath my quiet exterior, a cold fury began to take root. They thought I would simply fold. That is the fatal flaw of men like Lawrence, Bradley, and Spencer. They do not notice quiet men like me until the foundation of their entire structure cracks open and swallows them whole. They think silence means surrender. They never imagine it means strategy. That first night, I did not shed a single tear. I sat at my chipped kitchen table in sweatpants, staring at the severance packet. It was only 2 pages of vague corporate jargon and a signature line sitting on the table like a dead weight. Next to it was a glass of cheap wine, a microwave meal, and the kind of heavy silence that reminds you are completely on your own. I watched the wine coat the glass, feeling the bitter sting of the situation. I had spent 15 years being dependable, cleaning up after every executive blunder like a corporate janitor. And for what? A cardboard box, a security escort, and a final insult that made me feel entirely discarded. I looked at the paperwork again. The legal release stated that by signing, I agreed to forfeit any and all claims related to my employment or termination. It was the legal equivalent of telling me to take my crumbs and be grateful. I stared at the envelope, my mind drifting back to the old days. Back when compliance was ignored, so I rebuilt the entire system from scratch. I had quietly, thoroughly slipped in protections that no one noticed because no one thought I mattered. Clause 12B. I said it out loud in the empty room. It had been a rainy Wednesday afternoon back in 2018. The chief financial officer at the time was too busy with his own distractions to review my compliance draft. Tucked into the back of that 50-page document was the clause. An insurance policy that triggered triple damages if a restructuring followed a material financial misstatement. I set my glass down, walked to my closet, and pulled out my fireproof lockbox. Inside were two encrypted thumb drives labeled Archive and CYA. I plugged the first one into my laptop, my fingers steady. Spreadsheets, audit trails, and internal memos filled the screen. This was not just hope, this was ammunition. And I knew exactly who I needed to call. I had not spoken to Miriam in over a year. Life, distance, and the daily grind of our careers had gotten in the way. But Miriam had been my classmate and close friend in law school. We had shared a cramped two-bedroom off-campus apartment to save money, and she was easily the fiercest, most brilliant person I knew. Back then, she once cross-examined a campus security officer for giving her a parking ticket and actually got it dismissed. Now, she was a senior partner at a boutique employment law firm that specialized in taking down corporate wrongdoers. I did not hesitate. I dialed her number. "Donald Hartman," Miriam answered, her voice as sharp and energetic as ever. "Please tell me you are calling for a catch-up dinner and not because you need legal revenge." I took a slow breath. "A little bit of both," I said, "but mostly revenge." I could practically hear her grin through the phone. "Tell me everything," she said. I walked her through the details slowly and meticulously. File by file, phrase by phrase, and transaction by transaction. When I finally reached the part about Clause 12B, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Send me the exact language," Miriam finally said, her tone suddenly shifting from friendly to clinical. I emailed her the text immediately. The next words she spoke made the glass in my hand tremble. "Oh, Donald," she said, "this clause is not a simple firecracker. It is a thermonuclear warhead, and you have been sitting on it for 6 years." I looked at the severance envelope sitting on my desk, picked it up, and dropped it directly into the trash. Miriam called me back the very next morning before the sun had even risen. I was sitting in my bathrobe, clutching a hot cup of coffee like a shield. I had barely slept, haunted by spreadsheets and the mocking sound of Bradley's laugh echoing in my head. Miriam skipped the pleasantries. "I read it 5 times, she said. "Donald, it is completely airtight. Because this clause is tied directly to the federal protections of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, specifically Section 18 U.S.C. Section 1514, they have backed themselves into a corner. If their quarterly report contains even a single material misstatement and they restructured you out of your job immediately after, they owe you everything. We are talking about triple back pay, statutory damages, and full attorney fees." Miriam went on to explain that by embedding this into a binding employment contract, we had bypassed the need to spend years litigating labor disputes in administrative courts. We could hold them directly to their breach of contract terms, which carried immediate financial liability. I did not smile, I just said, "Let us begin." Miriam's voice dropped an octave, filled with professional focus. "We will do this clean, no press releases, no warnings. Let us make them think you went quietly into the corporate night." And just like that, our operation began. I pulled out my backup drives and began organizing my digital vault. I had audit trails, email threads, and server logs with metadata so old it still referenced older operating systems. If an executive had so much as touched a cell in a spreadsheet, I had the exact timestamp. Miriam created a secure server and organized the evidence by date, topic, and signature. She was surgical. No emotional language, no threats, just cold, hard facts. We cross-referenced my termination date with the company's first and second quarter financial reports. We flagged 4 distinct discrepancies, 3 omitted liabilities, and 1 damning forecast note that had been revised after the official board presentation. That particular revision was incredibly obvious. Next came the legal chess moves. Miriam filed what she called a quiet signal. It was a formal legal inquiry delivered by a courier directly to the company's legal department. No aggressive threats, just a precise question. In light of the adjusted earnings and the timeline of my client's termination, we request clarification on whether Clause 12B applies retroactively under the current restructuring policy. The letter was sent to legal, Carbon copied to the board of directors, and Blind Carbon copied to a neutral arbitrator known for having zero patience for corporate games. My name was not even mentioned in the initial query. Yet within 72 hours we received our first response. It was a short, vague email from their human resources contact, Sandra. It stated they would be happy to reopen discussions regarding my exit package to find a mutually beneficial resolution. Miriam laughed when she read it. They just realized the bomb is ticking under their conference table, she said. I did not answer. I was busy looking through my inbox from 8 months ago, searching for a specific email draft. I found it. A memo from Lawrence discussing the debt restructuring with a comment from Bradley that said, "Adjust language here, too risky to disclose liabilities." I saved it to the folder. Each file was not just revenge. It was a clinical dissection of how men in power write off quiet professionals because they do not shout in meetings. They had no idea what was coming. The official quarterly report dropped like a lead weight. I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing every single page of the document, searching for the crack in their armor. I found it on page 45, buried in the footnotes under subsection 5D. It was a single, sterile sentence admitting that management had adjusted prior projections because they had not accounted for deferred liabilities associated with equipment leasing. It was written in dry legal jargon designed to put readers to sleep, but it was the exact tripwire defined in Clause 12B. They had officially filed a material misstatement of financial projections, and that action was immediately followed by a departmental realignment that eliminated my role. I took a screenshot, attached the PDF, and sent it to Miriam with a single word: go. The arbitration request was submitted by noon. We chose a private conference room in a neutral downtown law firm to avoid any public spectacle. The room had glass walls, minimalist paintings, and fake plants that looked exhausted. The air conditioning was freezing, running at maximum capacity as a silent protest against the summer heat. I arrived at exactly 9:45 in the morning, wearing my charcoal gray suit and a dark blue tie. I did not carry a bulky briefcase, just a slim folder labeled Clause 12B. As I walked through the lobby, I saw the security guard who had escorted me out just a few weeks prior. We exchanged a brief, silent nod of mutual respect, and I walked up to the elevators. Miriam sat right next to me, her hair pulled back tightly and her expression professional. At 9:55 in the morning, the door opened. Bradley walked in first with his fake grin and scuffed loafers. Behind him was Lawrence, looking pale and noticeably sweaty. 2 board members entered behind them: Carlton, a heavy-set man wearing an expensive watch, and Owen, a younger board member who looked irritated to have his day interrupted. I did not stand or speak. I simply watched the clock. At exactly 10 o'clock, Miriam cleared her throat to begin. "Thank you all for joining us," she said. "I would like to begin by referencing Clause 12B of the Corporate Risk Policy, revised in 2018. Bradley chuckled dismissively, adjusting his cuffs. "We are fully aware of your interpretation," he said. Miriam held up one finger, stopping him. "Not interpretation," she said calmly. "Application." She reached into her bag and slid a printed copy of the official quarterly report across the table with page 45 circled in red ink. Then she slid the original compliance policy document behind it, with Clause 12B highlighted in yellow. Bradley's smirk vanished. Lawrence's mouth twitched. The room fell silent. "This revision," Miriam continued, "constitutes a material financial misstatement. You filed projections that omitted massive liabilities, and you immediately followed that with a restructuring that eliminated my client's position. Under the clear terms of Clause 12B, that action entitles Donald to triple damages, retroactive back pay, and full legal representation costs. Bradley opened his mouth, trying to salvage his confidence. He scoffed, claiming that even if the clause applied, we could not prove deliberate intent, or that it was anything more than a minor administrative error. Miriam smiled, though her eyes remained cold. She reached into her folder and slid a printed email thread from 8 months ago. Across the table, it was the exchange between Lawrence and Bradley, discussing the debt restructuring, where Bradley had explicitly signed off on adjusting the language to hide the liabilities. The metadata was clearly displayed at the top, showing the email had been sent directly from his corporate account on a Sunday afternoon. The silence in the room returned, but this time it was heavy with panic. Carlton, the senior board member, stared at the email, his expression hardening. He turned to Lawrence, then to Bradley, his jaw tight. He looked back at Miriam. "What is it you are asking for?" he asked, his voice low and serious. Miriam did not hesitate. Full enforcement of Clause 12B, a settlement of $1,850,000, a formal letter acknowledging wrongful restructuring, and a signed confidentiality agreement within 15 business days. Lawrence looked like he might throw up. Bradley tried to laugh, but it came out as a weak cough. I sat perfectly still, watching them realize their position was entirely indefensible. The young board member, Owen, rubbed his temples, already looking like he wanted to wash his hands of the entire mess. They knew they had been cornered by the very rules they had ignored. I looked at Bradley, remembering his arrogant laughter in the termination meeting when he told me no compliance officer negotiates severance here. I wanted to see if he was still laughing now. He was not. He was staring at the email thread like it was a death warrant. Carlton turned to Owen, whispering something in a hushed tone before looking back at Lawrence. "Is this email accurate?" Carlton demanded. Lawrence swallowed hard, fumbling with his water bottle. "There was context," he began, his voice cracking, but Owen interrupted him. "The context is that we signed off on a public filing that hid liabilities, and we fired the compliance officer who flagged it." "That is the definition of a Sarbanes-Oxley violation," Owen said, his voice flat. They were completely trapped, and they knew it. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly shattered by the sound of ceramic meeting wood. Lawrence's hand had been trembling so violently that he dropped his coffee mug. It slipped from his slick fingers and splattered lukewarm coffee all over the polished oak table and the carpet below. Nobody moved. The brown liquid spread slowly, pooling near Bradley's expensive but scuffed leather loafers. Bradley's face flushed from a pale white to a deep, angry shade of crimson. He opened and closed his mouth several times, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he had walked into a trap of his own making. A young paralegal rushed into the room with paper towels, fumbling to clean the mess in a state of sheer embarrassment, but Carlton waved him out of the room with a sharp gesture. I sat back, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I did not need to speak. The evidence was doing all the heavy lifting for me. Finally, Carlton turned his gaze to Lawrence, his expression grim. "Lawrence, is this document accurate?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. "Did you actually authorize these misleading projections?" Lawrence tried to speak, but his voice was thin. "There was context," he stammered. "We were planning to adjust the figures in the second quarter." Miriam leaned forward, her elbows on the table. "Misstatements, Lawrence," she corrected. "Not adjustments." Bradley tried to intervene, fumbling with his pen. "We acknowledge there may have been a misunderstanding here," he said. His voice lacks its former arrogance. He tried to suggest that my career prospects in the industry might be affected if this went public, a subtle threat of blacklisting. Miriam did not hesitate, warning him that retaliation claims carried personal criminal liability under federal law. Bradley shut his mouth instantly. "We are prepared to offer Donald a settlement of 4 months' salary," Bradley said, clearing his throat. "Let us settle this quickly and move forward." 4 months' salary, Miriam repeated, her voice dripping with amusement. "Interesting, but Clause 12B explicitly entitles my client to triple damages, full retroactive pay, statutory penalties, and full coverage of attorney fees. 4 months does not even cover our initial consultation." Carlton sighed, rubbing his face. "Triple damages," he muttered. That is extremely aggressive. Miriam did not back down. Your chief financial officer's emails showed deliberate intent to conceal material liabilities from the board and the public. That is not aggressive, gentlemen. That is fraud. If we proceed to public arbitration, the Securities and Exchange Commission will be the least of your worries. Shareholder lawsuits, class actions, and reputational damage will follow. Shall I continue? The younger board member, Owen, looked at Lawrence with pure disgust. What is the final number to make this go away quietly? Owen asked, looking at Miriam. Miriam slid another sheet of paper across the table. $1,850,000, inclusive of legal fees. We require a signed confidentiality agreement immediately and a formal letter acknowledging wrongful restructuring delivered by Friday. Carlton looked at Lawrence like he wanted to fire him on the spot. We need 48 hours to discuss, Bradley said. Miriam stood up slowly, smoothing her blazer. You have 48 hours, she said. If we do not have a signed agreement by then, we file publicly with all exhibits. They did not wait 48 hours. Within 24 hours, the agreement was finalized. The board accepted every single one of our terms. Carlton insisted that Lawrence and Bradley sign the formal acknowledgement of wrongful restructuring immediately, choosing to sacrifice their careers to shield the board from liability. Lawrence was placed on indefinite administrative leave, and Bradley was terminated from his position as in-house counsel. When we met to sign the final paperwork, the conference room was incredibly quiet. I took the settlement check, reviewed the signed contract, and slid them into my folder. Each signature was a testament to the fact that they could no longer ignore the rules they had spent years bypassing. I stood up, shook Carlton's hand briefly, and walked out of the building, stepping into the bright afternoon sunlight. I did not need a cheering crowd. The quiet victory was more than enough. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, pouring myself a glass of wine from a corked bottle. No cheap boxes tonight. Miriam called me an hour later, and we spent some time reminiscing about our law school days and laughing about Bradley's face when the email was revealed. I looked out the window at the city lights, feeling a deep sense of relief. What stands out most here is the power of being quietly prepared. Sometimes the best revenge is not explosive. It is silent, precise, and utterly irrefutable. True career justice comes from understanding the system, having patience, and letting the facts speak louder than anger. In the end, it is not about how loud you shout, but how well you play the game. Big thanks for watching, you sneaky seniors. Subscribe to keep the coffee pot brewing revenge. Your ex-colleagues won't know what hit them.